A young woman wept at his son's grave. Hell's angels helped heal an old promise. "Please don't move him," Audrey said, her voice low enough to sound like a secret she was ashamed to need. "Seth promised me I could stand here when the leaves turned." She had no ring on her hand that the county would recognize, no marriage license in the folder Trent kept waving at her, only a mud-streaked wedding dress folded against her chest, and a death certificate softened at the corners from being handled too many times. The cemetery fee notice showed $875 in red ink, due by 5 p.m. And the wet hem of the dress dragged across the concrete behind the cemetery supply counter, where rusted brackets, bent stakes, brass number plates, and half-empty bags of setting sand crowded the narrow space. Trent Fowler stepped closer until Audrey's back met the cold metal shelf, his smile thin, his voice careful enough to sound official, while he told her Seth's grave could be moved to the unmarked section before Thanksgiving if the legal family failed to object. Then the light behind Trent went dark, for enormous shadows filled the back room, broad enough to swallow the doorway, carrying the smell of exhaust, wet leather, black coffee, damp earth, and old road dust, and the concrete floor carried a low tremor beneath their boots, as Floyd, Brick, Garrison, and 3 Hell's Angels brothers spread out, without a word. Trent turned first, not from courage, but from instinct, and found Floyd's shoulders blocking the narrow path like a piece of the wall had stepped forward. Floyd was a big white man in his late 60s, thick through the chest, with a gray beard cut close at the jaw, eyes so cold and steady they seemed to measure every lie before it left a mouth, and a worn black coat carrying the bitter scent of gas fumes and coffee that had gone stale in a paper cup hours earlier. Behind him, the 3 brothers took their places with the quiet order of men who knew how to control a room without raising a hand. One stood near the rear service door beside a rack of cemetery markers. One stopped at the short hallway leading back toward the office. One remained by the entrance, arms folded, face unreadable, leaving Trent nowhere to feel tall. No one touched him. That made it worse. Audrey tightened her grip around the dress, the lace pressed so hard under her fingers that the mud squeezed through the folds, and Floyd's eyes moved from the brown stain along the hem to the death certificate shaking in her hand. For 1 second, his face changed. Not soft, broken. Trent cleared his throat and lifted the folder higher, trying to make paper bigger than the men around him. "This is Cemetery Property Administration," he said. "She has no legal standing here." Floyd did not answer him right away. He stepped close enough for Trent to smell the road on him, but not close enough to threaten. The cramped space held its breath. Rusted metal, wet leaves, damp soil, and fear sat heavy in the air. Floyd looked at Audrey. How old was Seth when he passed? Audrey swallowed, forcing herself to stand straighter even with the dress in her arms. 32. Floyd's jaw tightened once. "A grown man," he said. Trent shifted his weight, the paper folder trembling at its top corner. "That does not change the policy." Floyd turned his eyes back to him, unblinking. "No," he said, "but lying about a grave does." Trent's face colored, then drained. Outside the supply room's narrow window, the gray late autumn afternoon pressed against the glass, rain threading down in thin lines, isolating the cemetery from the road and every ordinary thing beyond it. Audrey glanced past Floyd and saw the 3 silent bikers still holding their positions, not like a mob, not like a threat, but like witnesses who had already decided the truth mattered more than comfort. Floyd lowered his gaze to the notice in Trent's hand. "You told her Seth was going to the unmarked section." Trent licked his lips and tried to tuck the folder against his coat. Floyd's voice stayed level. "Put the papers on the counter." Trent looked toward the service door. The brother standing there did not move. Trent looked toward the hallway. The second brother stared past him like stone. Trent looked toward the entrance. The third man gave him nothing. Floyd finally looked back at Audrey, and for the first time his voice carried something heavier than command. "I came to see my son," he said. "Looks like I got here before another promise got buried with him." Audrey stared at Floyd, as if the words had reached her before she could decide whether to believe them. The wedding dress sagged in her arms, heavy with cemetery mud along the train, one pearl button missing from the back seam, and the death certificate stuck to her palm, where rainwater had softened the folded edge. Floyd kept his eyes on Seth's name, not on Trent, and for a moment the hard lines in his face looked older than his years. He had said my son. Audrey looked from Floyd's gray beard to the broad shoulders filling the supply room, then down to the black ink on the paper, where Seth's full name sat above the date that had split her life in two. "You're Floyd," she said, and her voice did not break, though it came out thin. "He said you might never come." The words hit Floyd harder than any accusation. One of the silent Hell's Angels brothers lowered his eyes for half a second, then returned to watching the hallway, while the other two held their places near the rear door and the entrance, adults standing in a room too small for lies to breathe. Trent shifted behind the counter, trying to turn the moment back into policy, but his thumb kept rubbing the corner of the folder until the paper curled. Floyd did not look away from Audrey. "He talked about you?" Audrey nodded once, still guarding the dress against her ribs like somebody might take even that from her. "He said he wanted you at the wedding. Then he said some promises have to be carried even when the people who should carry them refuse." Floyd's face stayed still, but his right hand closed around the edge of his worn coat. The coat smelled of highway exhaust, black coffee, wet wool, and the kind of cold that settles into a man after too many miles alone. He had come to the cemetery after 3:40 p.m. because that was when the office usually thinned out, when the old groundskeeper went to the maintenance shed and the gravedigger locked the equipment gate, when a man could stand by a grave without being asked who he had failed. That was Floyd's habit. Cowardice with a schedule. Trent leaned forward, forcing a professional tone that did not fit the sweat gathering at his hairline. "Family matters do not alter cemetery administration. She is not the spouse of record, and unless you have documentation proving legal control of Section B, Row 6, Plot 17, I am within my authority to process relocation." Audrey flinched at the word relocation. Floyd noticed. The three brothers noticed too, but none of them moved closer. Their stillness did the work. The room carried the sour smell of rusted metal, damp cardboard, wet leaves trapped under boots, and soil that had been opened and closed too many times. Floyd finally turned toward Trent, his eyes unblinking. "You said Section B, Row 6, Plot 17. Trent lifted his chin a fraction. "That is correct." Floyd looked at the folder on the counter. "Then you know exactly which grave you tried to sell twice." Trent's mouth tightened, and one hand drifted toward the drawer beneath the counter, where office stamps and receipt pads were kept. The brother near the entrance did nothing except angle his shoulders enough to remind Trent that every movement in that room had a witness. Floyd spoke to Audrey again, softer but still rough. "Seth was 32. He made his own choices. I hated that one of them was walking away from me." Audrey did not answer, because there was no clean answer to a father admitting the ugliest part of himself beside the woman his son had loved. Floyd glanced at the dress. "He bought that with you?" "We paid $214 down," Audrey said. "The shop held it for 6 months. He said we would finish the rest after harvest work." Floyd swallowed once, slow and painful. Trent tried to step around the counter with the notice in hand, but the narrow aisle, the shelves of brass plates, and the silent biker by the rear door left him with nowhere graceful to go. He stopped. Floyd saw it and said nothing. Audrey saw it too, and for the first time since Trent had cornered her, her shoulders lifted from the shelf behind her. Floyd reached into the inside pocket of his coat, but he did not pull anything out yet. He only touched the folded packet there, the one he had carried for months, without finding the courage to use. Then he looked at Trent like a storm had learned patience. "Keep talking," Floyd said. "I want her to hear every lie before I show her what Seth still owns." Trent tried to smile, but his mouth would not hold the shape for more than a second. The four men had not raised their voices, and that made the small supply room feel smaller, as if every shelf of rusted brackets, grave flags, marker screws, and brass lot numbers had leaned inward to hear him explain himself. He spread the folder on the counter with careful hands and tapped the top sheet beside the red $875 balance, pretending the number was law instead of pressure. "This account is delinquent," he said. "The cemetery has maintenance costs, transfer costs, and administrative fees. Without a surviving spouse of record, a fiancé has no authority to stop reassignment. Audrey's arms tightened around the dress, and the mud along the hem left a dark line across the front of her coat. Floyd watched the red ink. He did not blink. Trent slid another sheet forward, one with a narrow paragraph printed in small gray letters near the bottom, and used his finger to follow a sentence about abandoned plots, family consent, and operational discretion. This clause applies when a plot lacks active family management, Trent said, speaking faster now. Section B, Row 6, Plot 17 has no properly filed objection on record. If the space is needed, the remains may be moved to a municipal care section, and the original plot may be reassigned. Audrey looked sick at the word reassigned, not because it was loud, but because it sounded clean enough to hide cruelty. Floyd's jaw worked once beneath his gray beard. Behind him, one brother stood by the entrance, with his shoulders squared, another stayed near the rear service door, and the third had taken a position at the hallway, where the ceiling dropped low over stacked bags of setting sand. None of them spoke. That silence had weight. Trent kept reading, but sweat had begun to gather in the hollow above his collar even, though rain chilled the narrow window, and the room smelled of damp soil, wet wool, rusted metal, and old leaves tracked in from the cemetery path. She was given notice, Trent said. She failed to satisfy the balance before 5 p.m. today. It is 4:42, Floyd said. Trent stopped. Floyd looked at the round wall clock above the supply ledger, then back at the notice. You told her she was already out of time. Audrey lifted her eyes. Trent pulled the paper back half an inch. Verbal urgency is allowed when accounts approach closure. Floyd reached across the counter, not for Trent, only for the notice, and turned it, so Audrey could see the printed deadline. His scarred fingers were steady, the nails darkened, from old road grease, the knuckles broad and weathered, but he handled the paper, as if one wrong fold could hurt her more. He lied about the hour, Floyd said. Now listen for the rest. Trent's face tightened. He flipped to another sheet and pointed to a stamped box marked pending review, then claimed it meant the cemetery board had approved a transfer request. Floyd leaned closer to read the date. This stamp is from last Tuesday. Trent swallowed. That is when review began. Seth was buried here 9 months ago, Floyd said. You began selling pressure last Tuesday. The brother near the rear door shifted his stance by a few inches, enough to make Trent glance that way and lose his place on the page. Floyd's voice stayed flat. Keep reading. Trent tried, but the words came unevenly. He said the plot could be opened if the legal family stayed silent. He said Audrey's promise did not create standing. He said a wedding dress was not documentation. Audrey lowered her head at that, and Floyd saw mud drying in the lace along the sleeve, saw the missing pearl button, saw the folded death certificate pressed between her fingers like a receipt for a future stolen before it arrived. His eyes went cold again. You cornered a grown woman behind a supply counter and used small print to take a grave from a dead man, Floyd said. Trent stepped back until his belt touched the shelf behind him. A row of metal number plates shifted against one another, and he froze, as if the room itself had corrected him. No one smiled. No one moved in on him. Floyd placed the notice flat beside the death certificate, aligning the edges, with a patience that made Trent's breathing turn shallow. One more time, Floyd said. Section B, Row 6, Plot 17. Trent stared at the papers. Yes. Floyd touched the inside pocket of his coat again, and this time the folded packet rose just enough for Audrey to see the red seal through the edge of a clear plastic sleeve. Good, Floyd said, because that is the first true thing you have said. Floyd did not pull the packet free yet. He held it halfway inside his coat, the clear sleeve catching a strip of gray window light, and Audrey stared at the red seal, as if it were something impossible rising from under the ground. Trent saw it too, and the confident rhythm he had built out of forms and fees fell apart in his throat. That could be anything, he said, though his eyes had already started searching for a place to run. Floyd looked at him for one long second, then turned back to Audrey with a patience that made the room feel even tighter. Seth never told you why I stayed away, did he? Audrey shook her head. The wedding dress shifted in her arms, its muddy train brushing the concrete, and one damp sleeve hung loose like an unfinished vow. Floyd lowered his hand from the packet and let the truth stand before the paper did. He came to me at 59 miles an hour and full of plans, Floyd said. Said he was marrying you. Said he wanted out of the old anger, out of every hard thing I had taught him by mistake. His mouth flattened, not with pride, but with the weight of a man forced to hear himself clearly. I told him, if he walked out, with that promise, he did not have to come back for my blessing. Audrey's face changed then, not into accusation, not exactly, but into the quiet pain of finally meeting the missing piece. Floyd accepted it. He deserved that look. Rain dragged thin lines down the little window above the counter, and beyond it the cemetery lay under a dull late-autumn sky. Every stone marker darkened, every pile of leaves pressed flat against the grass. Inside, rusted metal, wet cardboard, black coffee, exhaust, and damp soil gathered in the cramped air. The three Hells Angels brothers did not move. One guarded the entrance, one held the rear service door in his peripheral vision, and one stood beside the low hallway, with his hands folded at his belt, all of them silent enough to turn Trent's breathing into the loudest weakness in the room. Floyd kept speaking to Audrey, because she was the only person in the room who had earned the truth. 2 weeks later, I got the call. A grown man was gone, and his father had spent his last words like a fool. Audrey lowered her eyes to the death certificate, where Seth's age sat in black type, 32 years old, too young for a grave, and old enough to have chosen the woman kneeling beside it. Floyd drew in a heavy breath, through his nose, and looked at the dress again. I came here at dusk for months. Never when anyone could see me. Never when I had to stand in front of what I did. Trent tried to use that confession like an opening. Then this is a personal dispute, he said, too quickly. A family matter, not a cemetery matter. Floyd's eyes cut back to him. You made it a cemetery matter when you put a price on fear. Trent backed against the shelf, and the brass lot numbers behind his shoulder shifted in a crooked stack. Floyd finally removed the packet from his coat. The plastic sleeve was worn at the corners, but the papers inside were dry, flat, and carefully preserved, with a red county filing stamp, a cemetery receipt number, and Seth's exact grave location printed in clean block letters. Section B, Row 6, Plot 17. Audrey's lips parted, but no sound came. Floyd placed the packet on the counter between the death certificate and the fee notice. He did not slide it toward Trent yet. I bought it 3 days after the funeral, he said. Perpetual care. Full plot protection. Paid in full. Audrey looked at him, through the gray light, holding the wedding dress tighter, and for the first time her anger had nowhere simple to land. Why didn't you tell me? Floyd looked down at Seth's name. Because shame is easy when you hide it behind leather and miles. That sentence stayed in the room like a nail driven straight. Trent's hand drifted toward the paperwork, but Floyd's stare stopped him before his fingers crossed the counter. No threat, just judgment. Floyd turned the packet so Audrey could read the top page. I did one decent thing too late, he said. Today I am making sure it still counts. Floyd pushed the plastic sleeve across the counter, with 2 fingers, slow enough that Trent had to watch every inch of it travel past the fake $875 notice. The top page was not a letter, not a favor, not one of the soft promises Trent had been twisting into weakness. It was a perpetual interment rights contract, dated 9 months earlier, with the cemetery's own red filing stamp, a receipt number printed in the upper right corner, and a paid-in-full line for $3,200. Audrey leaned closer, still holding the muddy wedding dress against her coat, and saw Seth's name typed beneath the plot location. Section B, Row 6. Plot 17. It was real. Trent reached for the sleeve, but Floyd laid one broad hand flat beside it, close enough to stop the motion, without touching him. Read it where she can hear, Floyd said. Trent's throat tightened. He looked toward the rear service door, but the silent Hells Angels brother there stood, with his back near the stacked bags of setting sand, eyes forward, adult and motionless beneath the low ceiling. Trent looked toward the hallway, where another brother blocked the narrow turn by the brass grave plates. He looked toward the entrance, where the third brother's shoulders filled the frame. No one offered him escape from the truth. Trent bent over the document, and the room seemed to shrink around the smell of rust, wet cardboard, damp soil, exhaust, black coffee, and rotting leaves caught under the countermat. Perpetual care, Trent said, the words coming out dry. Full plot protection. No administrative relocation, without written consent from the purchaser of record or a court order. Floyd's eyes did not leave him. Keep going. Trent's fingers trembled against the plastic sleeve. Purchaser of record, Floyd Garrison. Audrey looked at Floyd then, and the pain in her face changed shape again, because the man Seth believed might never come had paid for a place no one could take away. Floyd kept his voice rough and even. Next page. Trent lifted the first sheet and found the receipt beneath it, stamped by the cemetery office, signed by the prior manager, with the grave number repeated beside a ledger code, and a blue ink notation marked family hold permanent. His cheeks lost color. There may have been a filing error, he said. Floyd gave him nothing. Read the amount. Trent swallowed. $3,200. Read the date. 3 days after the interment. Audrey closed her eyes for 1 second, not to fall apart, but to steady herself. The wedding dress had begun slipping from her arms, its mud-heavy hems sagging toward the concrete, and Floyd reached out, without hurry, taking only the edge that would have dragged through a puddle near the counter leg. He did not cover her with it. He protected the dress from the floor. Audrey saw that small choice and understood it better than any speech. Trent tried to gather the fake fee notice under his folder, but Floyd's gaze moved to his hand before the paper disappeared. Leave that out. Trent froze. It is an internal notice. It was in her hand, Floyd said. Now it stays where everyone can see it. The brother near the hallway shifted his weight just enough to make the floorboards answer beneath him, and Trent's shoulders tightened, as if the room had grown another wall. Floyd turned the contract toward Audrey. This does not make me a good father, he said. It only means Seth rests where he was promised to rest. Audrey opened her eyes and looked down at the official stamp, the paid receipt, the permanent hold, and the death certificate lying beside them like two halves of the same wound. He never knew? She asked. Floyd's mouth hardened. No, that was the cruelest part. Trent pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it against his neck, no longer pretending the cold room explained the sweat there. Floyd finally pointed to the bottom of the contract, where cemetery policy required a manager's written acknowledgement for any attempted change. You had this in the file. Trent looked away. I did not review every archived purchase. Floyd leaned in by 1 inch, still not touching him, still not raising his voice. You reviewed enough to know she had no marriage paper. You reviewed enough to choose 5 p.m. You reviewed enough to scare her behind a counter with a dress in her arms. Trent's lips parted, but no clean sentence came. Floyd slid the cemetery ledger toward him. Now review the part where you fix it. Trent stared at the ledger, as if the columns might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. The old cemetery book lay open beneath the yellow counterlight, its pages ruled in blue lines, each plot entered by hand beside receipt codes, burial dates, and caretaker initials, from years before Trent ever wore a manager's badge. Floyd kept the perpetual care contract flat with one hand and the false $875 notice flat with the other, leaving no paper hidden under a folder, no corner tucked away, no small print protected by the shadows. Write what the file says, Floyd said. Trent reached for a pen beside the stamp pad, then stopped when his fingers shook too much to hold it straight. This should be handled through the office, he said. There are procedures. Floyd's eyes stayed cold, steady, and unblinking. You had procedures when you brought her back here alone. Audrey stood beside the metal shelf, the wedding dress gathered carefully over both forearms now, its muddy hem lifted away from the wet concrete near the counter leg. Her face was pale, but she was no longer folded into herself. She watched the ledger the way a person watches a door being unlocked from the outside. The room pressed in around them, full of rusted stakes, brass plates, damp cardboard boxes, rain-dark coats, black coffee on Floyd's breath, and the buried smell of wet earth carried in from the graves. One of the silent Hell's Angels brothers remained at the rear service door, his boots planted beside a stack of 50-pound sandbags. Another stood at the hallway, broad shoulders blocking the low turn toward the cemetery office. The third held the entrance, still as a guardrail on a mountain road. They had said nothing since entering. That silence kept Trent honest longer than any threat could have. Trent tried again to gather the fee notice, sliding 2 fingers under the edge, as if he only meant to straighten it. Floyd moved the paper back to the center of the counter. No. Trent's lips tightened, and sweat rolled from his temple to the edge of his jaw. You do not understand administrative language, he said, but the words had lost their frame. Floyd looked at Audrey. Do you understand enough? Audrey nodded slowly. He told me, if I did not pay before 5 o'clock, Seth would be moved before Thanksgiving. Floyd turned back to Trent. Read the contract line about relocation. Trent looked at the page. He did not speak. The brother near the hallway shifted his gaze from the ledger to Trent's hands, and Trent's fingers pulled away from the papers, as if the ink had burned him. Read it, Floyd said. Trent bent over the contract. No relocation, transfer, reassignment, or opening of the interment space shall occur without written consent from the purchaser of record or applicable court order. Purchaser of record. Floyd Garrison, Trent said. His voice had gone small. Applicable court order. Trent swallowed. None on file. Outstanding balance. Trent looked at the receipt. Paid in full. Audrey lowered the dress slightly, enough to see the missing pearl button and the brown smear along the lace, and her expression changed from fear into something steadier, not relief yet, but footing. Floyd slid the ledger closer to Trent. Now write that the relocation notice was issued in error and has no standing against Section B, Row 6, Plot 17. Trent's hand finally found the pen. The first letters came unevenly across the incident line, and he stopped twice to wipe his palm on his trousers. He tried to make the correction sound harmless, calling it a clerical discrepancy, but Floyd placed one thick finger beside the false notice and said, "No." Trent looked up. "That is standard wording. Try honest wording." Trent's throat worked. He crossed out the phrase and wrote that the relocation notice was invalid because the plot was under perpetual care and permanent hold. He entered the correction under cemetery office procedure, using the incident line reserved for same-day administrative reversals. Audrey watched every word. Floyd did too. Outside the small window, rain blurred the rows of headstones into gray shapes, but inside that cramped back room, the truth had edges sharp enough to cut through every lie Trent had folded into policy. Trent signed his initials beside the correction, then reached for the office stamp. His hand hovered. Floyd did not move. The 3 brothers did not move. Trent pressed the stamp onto the ledger page with enough force to leave the red mark clean and square. Then he set the stamp down and stepped back until his shoulders touched the rusted shelf behind him. A few brass lot numbers slid out of alignment near his elbow. He did not look at them. Floyd picked up the corrected ledger and turned it toward Audrey. "Read the last line," he said. Audrey leaned over the counter, still holding the dress, and read it with her own eyes. Seth's grave would stay. For the first time, Trent had nothing left to sell. Floyd did not take the corrected ledger away from Audrey until she had read the line twice. Her eyes moved over the red stamp, the permanent hold notation, the receipt code, and Seth's exact grave location, until the words stopped looking like another trick and began to feel like ground beneath her feet. Trent stood behind the counter, with his back near the rusted shelf, one hand still damp around the pen, his collar darkened, where sweat had soaked through the fabric despite the cold air pressing through the narrow window. "Now the copies," Floyd said. Trent blinked at him. Floyd's broad shoulders cut off half the gray light from the room, and his worn coat carried the heavy mix of exhaust, black coffee, rainwater, and old leather. "Every paper she brought. Every paper you made. Every notice tied to Seth's plot." Trent looked down at the folder, then toward the entrance, where one silent Hell's Angels brother stood beside the open doorway without lifting a hand. The rear service door was watched by another brother, and the low hallway to the cemetery office was held in view by the third, all 3 grown men standing, with the kind of still patience that made Trent's own panic look childish and small. No one blocked him by force. The truth did. Trent opened the folder and began placing sheets on the counter. Audrey's copy of the death certificate, the false relocation notice, the $875 fee demand, a carbon receipt form, with no payment entered, and a thin yellow sheet marked preliminary reassignment review. Audrey stared at that last page. You had already started it, she said. Trent's mouth moved before the answer arrived. It was only internal. Floyd reached for the yellow page and turned it so the date faced him. Yesterday, he said, at 11:18 a.m. The room tightened again. Rain streaked the glass, blurring the headstones outside into gray blocks, and the smell of wet soil, rusted hardware, damp cardboard, and crushed leaves lay thick under the counter light. Floyd set the yellow sheet beside the corrected ledger. Void it. Trent shook his head once, then stopped when he saw that no one in the room had patience left for theater. That requires a manager's notation. You are the manager, Floyd said. Trent picked up the pen. His hand dragged across the paper as he wrote void due to perpetual care protection and invalid notice, then signed his initials with uneven pressure. Floyd watched every letter. Audrey watched Floyd. She had expected rage from Seth's father, maybe blame, maybe ownership over grief, but this was different. He was not taking Seth from her. He was standing where he should have stood before. Trent gathered the remaining papers into a stack, but Floyd held out his hand, palm up, not touching him, not demanding like a thief, only requiring what the correction already proved. Give them to her. Trent looked at Audrey then, really looked, and his face folded around the first clear knowledge that she was no longer alone in that cramped back room. He slid the documents toward her. Audrey could not free both hands because of the dress, so Floyd picked up the stack, aligned the corners against the counter, and placed it carefully under the death certificate she already held. Keep these together, he said. Contract copy on top. Corrected ledger copy beneath it. Void page 3rd. Audrey nodded, committing the order to memory, as if it were a road map out of a place she had almost been buried in, while still breathing. Floyd turned back to Trent. You will make one photocopy of the corrected ledger and the voided reassignment page before you leave this room. Trent's eyes darted to the office hallway. The brother there stepped aside only enough to reveal the copy machine at the far end, not enough to invite escape. Trent understood. He walked past him slowly, shoulders narrow now, and returned less than 2 minutes later, with 2 warm sheets held at the edges. Floyd did not thank him. Audrey did not either. Trent set the copies down, then reached for his coat from the hook beside the supply cabinet, missing the sleeve once before finding it. The old groundskeeper appeared beyond the windowed office door for a brief second, saw the 4 bikers, the papers, Audrey, and Trent's pale face, then wisely stayed in the outer room. Trent tried to leave through the service door, but the brother there remained still, so Trent chose the front entrance instead, squeezing past the wide shoulder of the man guarding it, without being touched. His shoes tracked wet grit across the concrete. Floyd let him go. At the doorway, Trent looked back, as if he wanted to reclaim some piece of authority, but Floyd was already turning the corrected papers toward Audrey, and the 3 Hells Angels brothers had become silent witnesses again, not jailers, not attackers, just a wall built around a woman's right to mourn. Trent walked out into the late afternoon rain, with his folder hanging open and no lie left inside it. Audrey carried the papers against her chest, with one arm, and the wedding dress, with the other, following Floyd out of the supply room and back into the cemetery's gray late autumn light. The rain had not grown stronger, but it had settled into everything, darkening the gravel path, flattening the brown leaves against the grass, and turning the low headstones into cold shapes under a sky that seemed to press down on the whole place. Floyd walked beside her, not ahead of her, and the 3 Hells Angels brothers followed 12 feet back in a quiet line, close enough to guard the moment, far enough not to claim it. No one spoke until they reached Section B, Row 6, Plot 17. Seth's stone stood beneath a narrow maple, with nearly bare branches, the carved letters wet and dark, the grass around the grave trimmed short except for a scatter of leaves gathered along the base. Audrey stopped at the foot of it and looked at the name, as if she had spent the last hour fighting for the right to read it without fear. Floyd stopped beside her, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground, his broad shoulders hunched against nothing he could fix with strength. The papers were safe now. That did not make the grave easier. Audrey knelt slowly, careful to keep the corrected ledger copy and contract in a clean folder against her coat, then laid the wedding dress across her forearms. The mud along the hem looked darker in the rain, and the missing pearl button left a small gap near the back seam, where the fabric would never close the way it was meant to. "We were supposed to stand under an arch of maple leaves," she said. 34 guests. A potluck reception in the church hall. He said he could build the arch himself for under $90. Floyd looked at the stone, not at her, because that detail had the power to split him open. He could build anything, when he stopped being angry long enough to measure twice, he said. Audrey turned her face toward him. "You knew that about him?" Floyd nodded. "I knew plenty. I just acted like knowing was the same as loving." The words came rough, stripped down, without polish. Behind them, the three brothers stopped near the path, standing between the grave and the cemetery office in silent formation, their dark coats and cut vests beaded with rain. Their presence no longer meant for Trent, but for the fragile privacy of two people learning how to share the same loss. Floyd pulled the perpetual care contract from the folder and checked the grave number again, as if he needed the paper to anchor him. Section B. Row 6. Plot 17. Paid in full. Permanent hold. He handed the folder back to Audrey. "You keep the original copies at home," he said. "Put one set in a bank box, if you have one. Make 2 photocopies before Monday. Give one to the cemetery office. Keep one with Seth's papers." Audrey accepted the folder with both hands. "Why are you giving me this much?" Floyd's eye stayed on Seth's name. "Because he chose you before I chose courage. That was all." Audrey lowered the wedding dress onto the grass beside the stone, not spread wide like a display, but folded carefully, the way someone lays down something sacred for a moment of rest. Rain touched the ivory fabric and softened the mud at the edges. Floyd stood there, with his hands open at his sides, a huge man in a worn coat that smelled of exhaust, black coffee, and wet road dust, suddenly unsure what to do, with all the space his pride had wasted. Audrey looked at him for a long time. "He waited for you," she said. Floyd's chin dipped once. "I know." "No," she said, firm now. "I mean, he waited angry, but he waited. There is a difference." Floyd closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them to the grave. "Seth," he said, and the name came out like a tool lifted with damaged hands. "I should have stood beside you when you asked me to. I should have met her before a cemetery office, and a crooked man forced it. I should have said I was proud before pride turned into a locked door." Audrey did not interrupt. The brothers behind him bowed their heads, still silent, still letting Floyd carry his own weight. Floyd reached into his coat and took out a small folded photograph, edges worn from months, in a wallet. It showed Seth as a grown man beside a half-repaired motorcycle, smiling with grease on his cheek and sunlight on his shoulder. Floyd placed it at the base of the stone, beneath the shelter of the folded dress. "I came here all these evenings and never left him anything but tire tracks," Floyd said. Audrey wiped rain from the photograph with her thumb. "Then leave something better now." Floyd looked at her, and for the first time his cold, unblinking stare gave way to a tired father's obedience. He bent down beside the grave, not easily, one knee stiff, one hand braced on the wet ground, and rested his palm against the stone. The cemetery stayed quiet around them, full of damp leaves, cold grass, and the iron smell of rain on old grave markers. Floyd did not ask Audrey for forgiveness. He did not ask Seth for an answer. He stayed there long enough for the apology to become real. Floyd stayed with one hand against the stone until his fingers had gone red from the cold. Audrey did not rush him. She knelt beside the folded wedding dress and the worn photograph, holding the corrected papers under her coat, so the rain could not reach the red stamp, and the 3 Hells Angels brothers remained on the path behind them like a quiet fence between the grave and the world that had almost taken it away. The cemetery office sat beyond the gray line of headstones, its supply room window dull with rain its crooked little counter now holding no power. Over Section B, Row 6, Plot 17. Trent was gone, from sight, and nothing about his leaving felt like victory. It only made space for grief to breathe. Floyd lifted his hand from the stone and wiped the damp grit from his palm across his coat, then looked down at the wedding dress. Mud had stiffened along the hem. The missing pearl button still left its small, unfinished gap, and a wet maple leaf had settled against the lace near Audrey's knee. Floyd bent slowly, one knee protesting under him, and picked up the dress with both hands, as if it weighed more than cloth. Audrey reached for it, but he held it for 1 second longer, not claiming it, not keeping it, only seeing what Seth had never been able to see. He picked right, Floyd said, his voice low and rough. He chose the right woman to carry his promise. Audrey's face tightened, and she took the dress back carefully, gathering the stained lace against her chest, without trying to hide the mud. "Then help me keep carrying it," she said. Floyd looked at her, and the old hardness around his eyes did not disappear, but it finally stopped fighting every decent thing inside him. "Every Sunday," he said. "4 o'clock if you want me here. I will not stand in your place. I will stand beside it." Audrey nodded once, small and steady. That was enough. Floyd picked up the photograph from the base of the stone, wiped rain from Seth's face with the edge of his thumb, and slid it into the front of the folder beside the perpetual care contract. He handed the folder back to Audrey in the exact order he had taught her. Contract on top, corrected ledger beneath it, voided reassignment page 3rd, death certificate behind them all. Practical mercy. She tucked it safely under her coat. One of the silent brothers stepped forward just far enough to set a small flat stone near the base of Seth's marker, weighting the corner of the folded dress, so the wind would not pull it into the grass, then stepped back, without a word. Floyd watched the movement, and gave the faintest nod, the kind men like him used, when words would only weaken what had been done. The rain kept falling in thin silver threads. Audrey stood, still holding the dress, and Floyd rose beside her, towering and tired, his broad shoulders catching part of the cold drizzle before it reached her face. For a long moment, the 4 bikers and the young woman stood together before Seth's grave, not healed, not finished, but no longer separated by lies. Then Audrey turned toward the cemetery path, with the folder pressed under her arm, Floyd walking at her side, and the 3 Hells Angels brothers following in silence, as the wet ivory dress rested against her coat, and rain continued to darken the name carved into the stone behind them. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.